Today, I'm honored to welcome Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to China Talk. We'll get into the Restrict Act, state capacity to analyze emerging technologies, the future of industrial policy, the nature and limits to bipartisanship around China, as well as the government's role in regulating artificial intelligence. Mr. Senator, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Jordan, thanks for having me on.
So let's start with the Restrict Act, your recent proposal to give commerce the ability to get between Russian and Chinese ICT suppliers and US businesses and customers. What's the path forward from a process perspective?
Well, Jordan, before I answer that, I want to lay out kind of my evolution um, on China. I remember when I was governor back in the early 2000s, leading a trade mission to China, very much encouraging more bilateral trade, encouraging greater academic exchanges. And then remember, starting in about 2010, I got on the Intelligence Committee, where what I was hearing in the public domain versus what I was hearing in the classified domain were almost night and day. This got much more contrast, stark contrast, when President Xi took over in the 2012 timeframe, where it became clearly evident that President Xi thought the CCP was going to maintain its leadership position, and that he wanted a more authoritarian regime. Two, that he saw this as a bilateral contest in terms of a lot of technology development, and that China, he was going to basically ignore traditional rule of law and encourage intellectual property theft at an unprecedented level. To the point that starting in 2017, I started hosting a series of what I call classified roadshow briefings, always on a bipartisan basis with leaders from the FBI, the Director of National Intelligence, CISA, the industry sector after industry sector, about this competition with China, as well as meeting with academic institutions. So, and I want to make clear at the front end of this podcast, and I think it's critically important to do so, is to make clear my beef is with the CCP and Xi's leadership. It is not with the Chinese people. It is not with the Chinese diaspora. Because I think when policymakers fail to do that, since so much of the diaspora communicates on platforms like WeChat, and it becomes fodder for the CCP to say, hey, see, this is just anti-Asian, anti-Chinese rhetoric. And it comes to Restrict. Restrict was something
Well,
evolved.
let's stay on the broader stuff then, if you want to start there. So, the kind of bipartisan evolution and like consensus on China is something you, as you just described, had a front row seat to. What do you think were there particular sort of turning points, and could you sort of describe the nature of the consensus and how far it goes today when it comes to policymaking on the Hill?
Well, I think as China changed its laws to make explicitly clear that all Chinese companies' first obligation is to the CCP, not to shareholders, not to customers, that was important. I think the big wake up call for me, and maybe as somebody who used to be in the wireless industry before I got involved in politics, the kind of shot across the bow of Huawei coming in and not only being a leading player in 5G wireless development, but also China starting to move into the standard setting bodies and literally flooding the zone on what had been normally standard setting entities that, regardless of where the technology was invented, the United States dominated. If anything, it became so bipartisan that, and particularly I would see sometimes on the Republican side, almost a rush to see who could out China hawk each other. That it's almost sometimes become problematic because there are clearly places where we still need to engage with China. There are clearly things that we cannot solve on their own. There's got to be a level of sophistication. For example, I strongly don't believe America should be buying Huawei telecom equipment because of the potential security risks, and having the whole hardware stack, running some of our wireless networks. But I'm still open to the idea of American semiconductor companies selling legacy chips to Huawei handsets, because that's a commodity item that would otherwise be they will be purchased from Korea, Taiwanese, Singaporean, other entities. So I do think trying to convince some of my Republican friends, we've got to have a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. particularly when I cite the example around the Inflation Reduction Act, because candidly, there's a series of areas like solar, like battery power, and others where we almost have to steal back or find a way to bring back technology from China if we are going to get the full advantage of some of those investments. So I do think it is an area where there is broad bipartisan consensus. I think I spent some time with Mike Gallagher, who the Speaker in the House put in charge of this China committee. I think Mike is a very smart and sophisticated guy, and so I think this is an area, and it's one of the reasons why I believe that the CHIPS bill, implementation of the CHIPS bill done correctly, is so important, because we're into areas that traditionally some of my Republican friends were reluctant to go towards, which is quasi-industrial policy, where failure to have America invest or allies invest will leave the field to Chinese entities, since they receive enormous amounts of government subsidies. But if we don't get the CHIPS implementation right, our ability to make similar type investments, whether it's in AI or quantum or synthetic biology, advanced energy, is going to be seriously diminished. So this is very much a work in progress, both in terms of implementation around chips, as we get into these questions about technologies that come from the China's, Russia's, Iran's, North Korea's. It was the basis and the genesis of the Restrict Act. The good news is it's broadly bipartisan. The bad news is that it is a field that is changing real time.
Sure. So, oh man, lots of follow-ups from that. So let's maybe stay on the Chips and Science Act first. Prospects for appropriations of the science part of that, as well as what you think the Chips Act team needs to deliver on in order to do this sort of execute in the sort of way that will unlock future investments in other emerging technologies in the future.
Well, let me take those in order. I think on the science portion, there is a great deal of interest in the tech hubs, and the Chips and Science Act had a very aggressive 20 tech hubs. I'm not sure we'll get to the full 20, but I do think there's enough states around the country that are interested in potentially securing one that I see the prospects for funding there pretty good. On the question, and I've met with the CHIPS implementation team. I think they're going about it in as smart and sophisticated way as possible. What I am immediately concerned with is, while $52 billion sounds like a lot, $39 billion of that will go as incentives. 12 to 13 billion goes to research, things like the defense industry. The 39 billion, while it sounds like a lot, when you look at the size and cost of investments of these fabrication facilities or factories, I am seriously concerned that the big announcements that have already been made, that the chip CEOs may come in and say, well, I was thinking I only needed $2 billion, but now with inflation, I need $3 billion. And I'm gravely concerned that money could all be eaten up just by the needs of the major announcements that have already been made. And I think that would be a serious error. And I think the CHIPS team understands that. I hope they will make clear in their guidance so the expectations are properly set. We have to not only, support the Intels and Microns and TSMCs and TIs, Samsungs, et cetera, but having this complete ecosystem, America and elsewhere located, but not concentrated in the PRC, means that money has to be spent not just on fabs, but needs to be spent on other components in the supply chain. And from the tools, which are very important, to the packaging at the other end after the fab process. And my fear is, just candidly, that the states that have already been winners will have senators and congressmen that are strong advocates of their states getting as much of this money as possible. And while the majority of states haven't benefited, are enough of the rest of us going to be willing to say, no, slow down. Let's make sure these investments are well made, but you've got to reserve for second and third round needs in terms of the supply chain.
Sure. Coming back to the sort of questions around bipartisan consensus on, what China is, where it's going, and how the US should respond. I'm curious if there are any you mentioned sort of sledgehammer versus scalpel as one of the risks you saw of things you might be concerned about the GOP going. I'm curious if there are any other sort of worrisome trends, as well as, what potentially could happen within Beijing that might change your might change some of your views on how the US should respond to China.
Well, I do favor the administration continuing to talk. I mean, I think, and I think things got beyond either side's control in a short sense when Secretary Blinken was planning on going, and then we had the incredible spy balloon fiasco. I think both sides wish those talks had been able to take place. Number one. Number two, I don't see any evidence that Beijing or President Xi in particular has any indication that he is backing off. If anything, his statements in recent weeks have been more, kind of pedal to the metal about decoupling or concern about, America rallying other non-authoritarian regimes into some kind of alliance. I think there is still, I still get surprised at times. We have continued to do these, what I again call classified roadshows. And we had a most recent one about a month and a half ago, and we had 40 Fortune 200 CEOs in the room, and one Fortune 50 CEO in this classified setting was basically saying, "Hey, Senator, come on, you don't really believe that Xi is going to move on Taiwan. You don't really believe this is going to get to crisis state." And I felt like, oh my gosh, you're supposedly a sophisticated CEO. You've got a company with huge international holdings. If you are not building into your business calculus the chance that she could take on military intervention, or even short of that, a major blockade, and that the possibilities of things ratcheting up is frankly, at this moment in time, higher, I believe, than things cooling off. It was a bit of a wake up moment for me that there's still a lot of people that don't want to believe the facts. I mean, I see this. I also saw this very much so pre-COVID from the American private equity business, who were making so much money investing in Chinese tech. They didn't even want to take the brief, and they didn't take the brief pre-COVID. No, post-COVID, private equity has taken the brief, and I think they are kind of more understanding of the risks, but it's still a shifting field.
Do you have a vision for how we get to a steady state where you don't have any of those scary scenarios, and the US and China are able to, end up living in a world without, I don't know, World War III coming down the pipeline? Like, where can we end up that's like acceptable for both sides?
The first place we need to start is to build up our alliances and not turn this into a binary choice where countries are positioned as you got to take the American side or you got to take the Chinese side. I think there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of openings now with a lot of nation states. One, we've seen many of the countries that have been recipients of the Belt and Road projects realize, hey, this deal sounded too good to be true. And it wasn't that great a deal. We didn't get the workforce because China would bring in their own workers. The quality of the infrastructure investments were pretty poor. And the debt levels that a lot of these nation states have picked up is terribly frightening. So with the Belt and Road countries, there's an opening. I think the way that Xi and through the COVID lockdown scared a lot of nation states. I think the treatment not only of the Uyghurs but of the people in Hong Kong in particular had set off an alarm. And I think the fact that throughout this period, CCP has continued to have massive intellectual property theft while they continue to do more and more locking down their own industries, gives us an opportunity. And part of that opportunity is even how we talk about things. I cringe when any American policymaker says, well, in regards to China, America and the West, or America and NATO, because every time we do that, we piss off 2/3 of the world. I was just in India. India is appropriately, as having a long border with China, obsessed about China. Most of our nation states in Asia. I mean, I think about the switch over even in the Philippines leadership in the last year, how their views on China have dramatically changed. I think about all these nation states in Africa or in South America, some of which were recipients of Belt and Road initiatives that would much rather do business with us, but we've got to reach out. So stage one is let's build as strong and broad an alliance as possible of non-authoritarian nations against the Chinas and Russias at all. I think where we obviously have to collaborate is around climate change. And, China is kind of trying to do both worlds at once, continue to invest and move forward fossil fuels, but also at the same time, invest at an even greater level than us on, greener energy and advanced energy. We're kind of following what they're doing in fusion energy and small modular nuclear. So I think we have to figure out where we need to collaborate. I think we need to keep these channels open. I can assure you that one of the things that concerns me greatly, and again, with the balloons was one example, but China in certain ways is obviously a great nation, but the communication structure we have with them is still a little fragile. I mean, we've had 70 years of animosity with the Soviet Union and Russia. There are many touch points beyond even kind of the direct, Washington, Moscow hotlines where events cannot, if things start to go awry, there's communication modes to try to put things on pause. We saw during the balloon phenomena where, as high as has been reported in the public domain, Secretary Austin trying to reach out to his Chinese counterparts and a whole host of individuals kind of down the chain of command trying to reach out, and nobody in Beijing picking up the phone. Now that kind of immature response is one of the ways that you could really lead to the kind of crisis where more reasonable heads could find ways to diffuse a potential crisis. So let's build the alliance. Let's find out where you need to communicate. Let's make sure, number three, that we have open communication modes to different levels in the Chinese government so we can avoid the unintentional crisis. And then another area where I see almost as dangerous as any particular item is, and this is where we and our friends need to better engage, and that is as these new technologies develop, how do we make sure that the standard setting bodies, this gets kind of nerdy, I know, but maybe hopefully your audience gets it, the standard setting bodies, the policy making entities that usually we've dominated, that China doesn't dominate them. Because, I know we'll get to AI in a moment, but with all the potential upside and downside of AI, an AI that had a Chinese underpinning with their lack of transparency, lack of respect for human rights, lack for respect in what I think most of the rest of the world would agree in, kind of basic human dignity values. If that doesn't scare you, that possibility, it should.
Yeah. So let's stay on this for a second. The sort of idea of a technological and economic equilibrium with China. You mentioned that, you were fine with us selling the sort of inputs to legacy nodes. Can you expand that more conceptually of where you see, what kind of framework you think is okay for the US and China to be engaging in from an economic and technological perspective for the next decade?
I think we have to open these communication, make sure that traditional and non-traditional communication modes are available, number one. Number two, I don't see, and from China's activities to the statements of President Xi and other Chinese leaders, though, anything that indicates in these technology competitions, anything that is based on a collaborative model. Most all of Xi's statements have been about, and some of the senior leadership have been about Chinese dominance, about winning the competition. And winning the competition doesn't mean, in my mind, is not a signal that you send if you're trying to say you actually want to, develop together or come to some common understanding or recognize there ought to be this free flow of goods. I mean, one of the things that has just amazed me for years, and I give again the CCP credit for their ability to kind of play off American business versus European versus Japanese when they were stealing intellectual property from all three, but able to play us off when we should have been allied against this kind of this unlevel playing ground. And we should all be collaborating, but I see some of that changing. And I think a lot of this will require, again, the private sector to recognize what still bothers me is the number of large private sector entities that say, yeah, I get that they are stealing from us. And I get the fact that, they don't abide by rule of law, and gosh, it's awful what they do to some of their own people, but it's such a big market. I got to turn a blind eye to that. I think that is changing. But unless there is, from business, some level of recognition that this is at the end of the line, not good for them if they're participating in an economy that treats their people so badly, or if you're suddenly giving up the price of that joint venture is you got to give up intellectual property, you've got to transfer your technology. That's still an evolving target. I think because we had that both alliance and we had that collaboration with business, I think we then go much stronger into the vision of how these two world's biggest economies can actually collaborate and work together.
So this is a nice transition point, maybe, to artificial intelligence, because you and your staff recently just wrote a letter to a number of leading OpenAI companies and labs, emphasizing this idea of research security, and sort of asking them, do they have Kaspersky on their computers, and sort of a number of questions, mostly along the lines of the very reasonable question of like, what happens when weights get stolen via industrial espionage? I guess I'm curious, but it is sort of interesting that, OpenAI, when it started releasing products, has a number of countries already on the list, regardless of what export controls are now, including China, that aren't able to gain sort of API access to its technologies. I guess I'm curious, what was the motivation behind that letter, and more broadly, where you think government has a role to play in the regulation and potential support of artificial intelligence?
Well, first of all, I'm trying to learn as much as I can, as quickly as I can. And the fact that I got a technology background may give me a tiny advantage, but it is small as I try to process all this myself, number one. Number two, I think, as you said, certain OpenAI, Sam Altman and his team, they are not participating in some of these nation states because China doesn't want, their people to be able to ask a question of a generative AI model to say, tell us about Tiananmen Square. So, the fact that it is all top down, but don't underestimate the amount of money and effort that China is spending trying to create their own platform here. And so what I tried to do was, where I've been educated, just the number of computer scientists that said they've been able to hack into some of these platforms already and change data about themselves, so that when they then query, one scientist talked about the fact that he made sure that anytime anybody queried him, they would put the word cow in there, and he'd say, Dr. X received all these numerous prizes, but unfortunately he's not done any major research on cows. But this ability to kind of hack in and change the output was where it generated that at least should be a recognition that we need security built in. So many of our systems on cybersecurity, for example, we bolt on cybersecurity after the fact. In these AI platforms, we need to build it in as these platforms are developing, not as an afterthought. So I thought this was a safe, good spot to put a marker down where I think there would be, broad consensus. In terms of a bigger role, I do believe there is a bigger role for government. I do believe there needs to be some regulatory guardrails. That the example of social media where we said, go forth, break things, and we'll figure out afterwards. We've not figured anything out afterwards, and at least the U.S. Congress's performance has been pitiful in putting any guardrails in place. if that were the case in AI, we're screwed. But what that proposal looks like, I want to be thoughtful, number one, and be better informed before I lay out some of those principles. And that's kind of a learning process I'm going through. And again, at least for today, on a good news basis, we're doing some of these listening sessions and learning sessions very much on a bipartisan basis.
So this sort of leads to questions about both the executive and legislative branch ability to sort of absorb, understand, and respond to emerging technologies. Over the past decade or so, you've had the U.S. government get a lot more active on both sides of these, on both sides of the promote and protect ledger. Last year, you proposed the American Technology Leadership Act, which was an idea to sort of create more analytical capacity within the executive branch to sort of understand relative strengths and weaknesses in particular industries. I'm curious, coming to the AI, bringing it back to your AI topic, like, we don't have the Office of Technology assessment anymore in Congress. Like, do you think there needs to be another sort of layer of investment in analytical chops, both on the Hill and in the executive branch, to help policymakers wrap their heads around these fast-moving issues?
Short answer is yes. Whether, whatever political capital I have, whether that's where I'm going to put all my, I'd rather be the wingman or wing person on somebody else pushing that, because I think it's important, but I don't think it's necessary, but not sufficient. And I do think we've seen, for example, AI, a lot of the work is happening at OSTP. And, one of the things that annoys me as a former VC and a former technology guy is the kind of disdain that most tech folks have for Washington until they need Washington. And so it's yes, we are an imperfect body to get all this stuff, but you ought to help us, because if not, we'll either cede leadership, which we've done, for example, if you look at all the things around social media, from privacy laws to content moderation to kids' online safety, we basically turned over the keys to the Europeans or the Brits, who've advanced rules on all of those. So we can either lose our traditional leadership position, or if you don't work with us and we don't do this in a thoughtful way, you get an overreaction or a simplistic approach that isn't as nuanced as needed. So, asking the folks, and I think at least sticking with the AI so far, many of the leaders that I've been talking with, I think will be the first to acknowledge, yes, we need some guardrails. Yes, we need some government regulation. The problem I found, at least dealing with the big platform companies, the social media companies, not in regards to AI, but in regards to Facebook and Google and Amazon, et cetera, is they're normally we're in favoring in theory, but when it comes to the written word, they've always got a problem. Not exactly that bill or not exactly this bill, even something as simple as like data portability and interoperability. Something that should be a low-hanging fruit. We've not been able to get that done. So I do think back on AI, holding these folks accountable to actually work with us to get a thoughtful regulatory framework is what I'm shooting for. And the security piece is a place to start. I think that's, again, there's virtual 100% agreement. So how we translate that into a legislative package will be something I'll be working on. But again, security is necessary, but not sufficient, just as is the question about getting more expertise within federal government, necessary, but not sufficient.
So let's come back to the Restrict Act for a second. Sort of process forward, as well as any changes you're excited to make in response to the sort of criticism you've gotten around the bill, with regards in particular to open source technology, as well as the impact on individuals.
Sure. Again, the genesis of this legislation was not about TikTok. It was about the fact our approach to foreign-based technology that poses a national security risk has been what I call whack-a-mole. You mentioned Kaspersky. A few years ago it was Kaspersky. We're still trying to deal with Kaspersky. More recently, it was Huawei and ZTE. Now it is TikTok. And what we thought was we need a rules-based approach that recognizes, particularly when we're talking about communication technologies, we had got to protect the First Amendment, that would give any of these entities their day in court. It would be incumbent upon the government, including the intelligence community that I oversee, to declassify as much information as possible. So it's not just the government says, but it's got to be, we got to prove our case. We've got to show control. And what was fascinating, because this is not just a phenomenon that's taking place in America, India banned TikTok 3 years ago at an individual user level. Canada, the UK, the European Union had banned it off government phones. More recently, the BBC told all their journalists to get off TikTok because you could be potentially being monitored. And again, the concern we have about TikTok is both the data collection possibilities, which ultimately might be able to be walled off, but so far have not. But equally, if not more important in mind, 150 million Americans using TikTok on average, what TikTok says, 90 minutes a day. You talk about a misinformation, disinformation, propaganda tool on steroids. Particularly as you see the numbers starting to say that about 40% of people between 18 and 24 get most of their news off TikTok. That, I believe, is a national security risk. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't also need to deal with Facebook and Google. I'm for a privacy bill. I'm for kids' online safety and for Section 230 moderation. But this is uniquely different because of the CCP ultimate control. And what we crafted, we thought was a very targeted, had no ability to touch an individual, was not some massive expansion of government power. Matter of fact, most of the language we took was taken directly from the rules surrounding the so-called 301 companies that are put on watch lists already. So it was not something new created. And what was curious was to see, we were moving along merrily and, picking up bipartisan supporters up to 26 now, 13 Democrats, 13 Republicans. The Biden administration came out in support. And then the TikTok CEO, Mr. Shou, testified and had I think uniformly viewed as pretty rough go at it. And TikTok, which has spent over $100 million lobbying, flicked a switch. And suddenly they are sponsoring, there's not a TV show you can turn on that doesn't ultimately have a TikTok commercial on it. All the little political cheat sheets that people on Capitol Hill read every day, the Politicos, the Axios, et cetera, were all being sponsored by TikTok. We suddenly get attacks from the right and the left, some of the more liberal members in the House and Tucker Carlson on the right, raising mostly completely false claims. But you spend a lot of money and you generate that buzz. So we are very much looking at changes and talking to folks, some of our critics, to say, how can we double make sure that even if TikTok were ultimately banned, if an individual in America decided he wanted to use a VPN or she wanted to use a VPN to get around it and get on TikTok, there would be no individual penalties, number one. Number two, how do we make absolutely sure that there's not some massive expansion of government powers under a Patriot Act 2.0? Number three, how can we make absolutely clear that an American company that happens to be doing business or touching China in some way couldn't be covered by this law? We don't think any one of those three are truly justified. But part of the legislative process is to kind of, if we have to put additional belt and suspenders or make the changes to rebut these arguments, the end of the day, it'll be interesting to see whether that will bring people along. Because one of the things I've said, listen, there's a lot of incredibly creative things going on TikTok. There's a lot of people that now make their living as social influencers. I'm all for that. I just feel like, I do hope, though, and believe that if TikTok were to go away, and it doesn't have to be an American company, there could be a Brazilian or an Indian or a Canadian company that would provide those same kind of earning opportunities and that same kind of creativity.
Let's talk about China and the intelligence community for a second. There's been a lot of reporting about sort of frustrations that Biden administration officials have expressed about their inability to get real concrete answers from the IC, as well as some news around, a new China center in the CIA and a China mission center in the CIA and a broader focus, transferring out of South Asia more towards engaging with questions around China. I don't know if you want to give like a grade of how this has been going, or maybe some reflections on the sort of challenges and what your what if anything needs to be done from a legislative perspective to keep that ball rolling.
Well, actually, and it's taken longer than it should, but we had our whole IC that was generally focused on kind of the terrorism threat for a decade. To go back to great power competition with Russia and China, and there was always at least the remnants of an operation vis-a-vis Russia, formerly the Soviet Union. So it was almost easier to go back towards Russia. To focus on China, has been a shift. I can tell you the budget proposals this year are finally hitting the numbers that I would like to have seen last year. I am surprised there is this new China Center, there is this new technology center at the CIA. I'll be seeing Intel leaders and literally today. So I think they're doing a pretty good job. But if they're not on making clear to the administration, for that matter, to Congress and the public, what those centers are focused on, I'll see if we can improve. But the bigger question here is, and it gets to a really hard, tough policy issue. Traditionally, the Intel community has spied on an opposing nation's military capability and their political leadership. The problem in 2023, at least in my mind, is national security is a lot different in 2023 than it was in 2003 or 1993. So simply who has the most tanks and guns and ships isn't necessarily who the winner is going to be. I do believe, and we've never faced an economic challenger like China that is making the kind of investments in these technology domains. I believe absolutely national security includes who wins the race for AI, who wins the race to where we produce semiconductors, who has the overhead capabilities in terms of satellites, who does synthetic biology, who does advanced energy. And the nature of our spying operations are we always look outward, which is we have this line that is, frankly, I think most people would be pleasantly surprised that it really is followed, maybe to the extreme, that we look out but don't look in. So if I go to the ODNI, the Director of National Intelligence, talk to their analysts, they might know a little bit about, well, first of all, getting them to focus on all these technologies rather than just the political leadership in the military is a work in progress, number one. But even if they are focusing on China's investments in fusion, and then we say, and how are we doing in comparison? We'll say, well, we can't look there. We can't, a Goldman Sachs first-year associate would know more about where we are in many of these technology areas than some of our best intel analysts. Now, people are recognizing this. General Nakasone, who's, I think, one of the real leaders at the National Security NSA that does a lot of our signals intelligence, has said he needs about 30 folks from Commerce Department to work on this. Secretary Raimondo, I think, they're doing a great job. I think she absolutely gets the fact, just as the CHIPS implementation is part of national security, that following these other technology domains is part of her job. But how we marry that information in a way that doesn't freak out the American people, but oh my gosh, we're looking at how America is developing in these various technology areas, is something we still got to figure it out, and then, make the case that this is critically important to the American public.
And is that a new body? Is that new authorities? Is that an open source center? Like, do you have a vision of what the solution is?
I would say that's also a work in progress. A lot of it will be around open source. We go back to the power of AI. Almost all of that has come from open source data. So, and sometimes convincing the Intel community that it's just as valid if it comes from open source as opposed to stealing a secret is, still a little bit of a mind shift. But laying out that in a thoughtful way to, one, make the case most broadly that national security is much broader than it used to be. And two, for us to compete, we need to really be looking, particularly China, where they're investing. And part of that, where they're investing and where they're making their progress, we have to also look at then how we and our friends are doing in comparison. And that's a different mission from a cloak and dagger spy or a James Bond movie, focusing on a particular political leadership or who's got the most advanced piece of military hardware.
If you go back to the some reports that came out with in the 80s between the US and Japan, you had like the Office of Tech Assessment really doing great work, looking industry by industry about where the US was relative to China and where the US could invest or not. But anyways, maybe we'll get that again. One last question for you. Uh have you thought much about AI's ability to improve domestic governance more broadly? I mean, how long should voters have to wait for IRS GPT, and like what is an appropriate lag between all of this stuff getting, improving productivity in the private sector versus that ending up impacting, everything from intelligence collection all the way to sort of more prosaic government services?
Great question. And matter of fact, Ian Bremmer, who follows a lot of the international affairs stuff, he had a good piece today on this very question. I don't think, I've not seen somebody articulate that vision yet. I hope I can get informed enough to at least help or put out some ideas about this. But to be honest with you, if we were having this conversation a year ago, I thought at that point AI was simply an overhyped term for advanced statistics. Then I started meeting some of these groundbreaking leaders and going, holy heck, this is a lot. And then I would even hear some of the folks, some of the guys, like some of the folks who did social dilemma, and some of the folks who've been, the technology doomsayers, and got to the point of a bit terrified and trying to now, adjust where I sit on that continuum, get informed in real time, and hopefully counsel my colleagues not to get so far in front of their skis on policy prescriptions that will either go too far or be kind of laughed at as being naive, is where we're trying to hit a sweet spot. And this question of the upside in terms of how citizens interact with government, the potential is great, but the potential for mischief is great as well. Thank you so much for having me. Hope we can do it again.